The summer of 1945 in central Kansas arrived without asking permission. By June, the wheat fields had turned the color of old brass, and the sky above the plains sat wide and pale and indifferent, the kind of sky that had no equivalent in Bavaria or Saxony or anywhere in a country that had spent 6 years learning to look at the ground. The women at Camp Concordia had been in America for 4 months, long enough to know the layout of the compound, long enough to recognize the guards by their walk, long enough to understand, in a quiet and practical way, that the war was over, not in the sense of speeches or surrender documents, but in the sense that the morning bell rang at the same hour every day, breakfast came in the same metal trays, and no one was shooting at anything. What they did not yet know was what America looked like beyond the fence. On the morning of June 11th, Corporal Danny Marsh appeared at the women's barracks door before 7, holding a clipboard and squinting against the early light. He spoke his German the way a man hammers a nail he cannot quite reach, with effort, at an angle, getting there eventually. Farm detail, he said. 5 women. Work clothes. 10 minutes. Brunhild Newman was already dressed. She had been awake since before the bell, sitting on the edge of her bunk in the gray pre-dawn with her hands folded in her lap, and the habit of early rising that 3 years in a Munich supply office had made permanent in her. She was 32 years old, broad-shouldered. With dark hair, she kept pinned close to her head and eyes that catalogued rooms before she had finished entering them. Before the war, she had managed food allocation ledgers for a district cooperative, columns of numbers that told the story of everything a region produced and everything it lacked. She had spent the war measuring scarcity in rows and figures. She understood, better than most, exactly how thin the margins had become. Ingrid Schultz was the second one dressed. She did everything with the speed of someone who had spent years being first. She was 28, angular, with a precise and careful way of moving that seemed to be saving energy for something. She had run a BDM district in Nuremberg before her auxiliary posting, and that history sat on her like a second uniform, not something she wore, but something that wore her. Farm work, she said quietly, pulling on her jacket. The word carried a faint edge of assessment rather than complaint, as if she were still deciding what category to file it under. Liesel Braun did not hear the announcement at all. She was 19 and slept deeply and completely, the way only the young can in uncomfortable places, and it took Marta Hoffman shaking her shoulder twice before she surfaced, blinking, with straw impressions on her cheek. "We're going outside," Marta told her flatly. "Get up." Marta was 42, from a village east of Leipzig, and she had the build and the temperament of someone who had done physical work every day of her adult life, and saw no reason to have an opinion about it. She had worked her family's land until her husband was conscripted, then worked it alone, then watched it requisitioned. She pulled on her boots without ceremony and studied the barracks floor as though calculating the day's weight already. Ruth Wenger dressed in silence near the window. She was 35 and had the economical movements of a nurse. Nothing wasted, nothing displayed. She had barely spoken in 4 months. Not from hostility, from a quality of attention that made speaking seem, for her, like an interruption. They assembled outside in the early light, 5 women in camp-issue work clothes, and Corporal Marsh counted them against his clipboard with the expression of a man running slightly late for everything. A second guard, young and wordless, stood near the vehicle. The truck was American military, olive green, its flatbed fitted with wooden bench slats along each side. To Hilda, it looked enormous. In Munich, requisition vehicles had grown progressively older and smaller as the war consumed the useful ones. This truck looked new, or close to it. The engine, when Marsh turned it over, caught immediately, without complaint, without the shuddering reluctance she associated with machinery that had been asked to do too much for too long. They climbed in. The guard dropped the tailgate behind them, and they pulled out through the camp's main gate, past the wire and the guard towers, and the last edge of the only American landscape they had known. The road opened ahead. Liesel turned immediately and watched the camp recede through the gap in the tailgate. Ingrid looked forward, spine straight, chin level, as though the act of looking sideways might concede something. Marta rested her forearms on her knees and studied the ground moving beneath them with the focused disinterest of a woman who had seen a great deal of countryside in her life. Ruth sat with her hands in her lap and watched everything without appearing to watch anything. Hilda looked at the fields. They went on in every direction without interruption. Row after row of wheat, close-cropped near harvest, trembling faintly in a wind that came from somewhere she couldn't identify. No rubble. No burned foundations. No gaps where buildings had stood and then hadn't. Just land, continuous and calm, doing what it had apparently always done, undisturbed. She had known, in the abstract way one knows things read on paper, that America had not been bombed. But knowing and seeing were separated by a distance that could not be measured in kilometers. The truck slowed, turned onto a gravel road, and a farm appeared on the left. Then another on the right. Then a third, further back, its red barn catching the early sun. Liesel leaned toward Hilda and said, almost in a whisper, "How many farms are there?" Hilda did not answer, because Marsh was already slowing the truck again, turning through an open gate onto a dirt track that led toward a white farmhouse, a long barn, and 2 trucks parked in the yard as though parking trucks were the most natural thing in the world. Marta straightened slightly and looked at the vehicles. Her eyes moved from one to the other and back again with the specific attention of someone who understood what she was looking at. "Both of those run," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "You can tell by the tires." Nobody answered her. If you are enjoying this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where in the US you are watching this video. The truck stopped. The engine cut. In the sudden quiet, a screen door opened on the farmhouse porch, and a woman stepped out, wiping her hands on a cloth, and looked at them with calm and unhurried eyes. She was perhaps 35. She wore canvas trousers, work boots, and a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her hair was pulled back. She carried no particular expression of welcome or suspicion, only the practical alertness of someone who had work to begin. Marsh climbed down from the cab and touched the brim of his cap. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. The woman nodded once. "Morning," she said. "Let's get started." Vera Calloway did not give a tour. She walked and expected them to follow, and that was the tour. Across the yard, past the 2 trucks, toward the long barn that ran parallel to the road. Her boots raised small puffs of dust with each step, and she moved with the efficiency of someone who had already been working for 2 hours before they arrived, which, as Hilda would later learn, she had. Marsh translated in fragments, walking slightly behind and to the side, his German arriving a beat after Vera's English like an echo with its own personality. South field needs weeding along the irrigation line. Tomatoes on the east side need tying. Barn needs mucking, 2 stalls. She'll show you the tools. Ingrid listened with her arms at her sides and her eyes slightly narrowed, not in hostility, but in the manner of someone filing information into categories that had not yet been fully labeled. Inside the barn, the smell hit first. Hay, oil, animal warmth, the faint iron edge of old machinery. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was, if anything, familiar. Marta inhaled it, and her shoulders dropped a fraction, as though something in her had recognized a language it had not heard in years. The barn was organized with a thoroughness that Hilda found immediately striking. Tools hung on a pegboard wall, each outlined in painted silhouette, so its absence would be visible at a glance. Feed was stored in sealed metal bins, labeled in a hand so consistent it might have been stenciled. Spare parts for machinery sat in wooden trays along a low shelf. Belts, fittings, bolts sorted by size into coffee tins lined up with their lids off. In Munich, by 1944, the supply depots Hilda managed had looked nothing like this. They had looked like the end of something. Shelves half empty, requisition forms stacking faster than stock could fill them, columns in her ledgers where numbers simply stopped because there was nothing left to record. This barn had the quality of a system that had never been interrupted. Vera lifted a set of hose from their hooks and distributed them with the same economy of motion she had used for everything else. No ceremony, no instruction beyond what was necessary, an expectation of competence that felt, oddly, like a form of respect. Liesel took hers with both hands and looked at it, as though verifying it was real. They were divided without drama. Marta and Ruth took the barn. Hilda, Liesel, and Ingrid were led by Vera toward the south field, with Marsh following at a short distance, his clipboard now under his arm, his role reduced to that of a man who was present in case language became necessary. The field was large. That was the first thing. Hilda had grown up in a city, but she had seen fields, managed allocation reports for farming districts, understood acreage in the way a person understands weight, without having ever lifted the specific object. But standing at the edge of Vera Calloway's south field with a hoe in her hand, looking at rows that ran toward a distant tree line without apparent end, she felt the difference between a number on a ledger and a thing that actually exists in the world. Ingrid stood beside her and said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, in German that Marsh was too far back to catch, "One woman owns all of this." It was not a question. It was the sound of a person reading a document they had not expected. "Her husband is in the Pacific," Hilda said. "Yes," Ingrid said. "I know." She paused. "That is not what I meant." They worked through the morning. The sun climbed and the air grew dense with heat in the particular way of flatland summers. Heat with nowhere to go, pressing evenly from above and reflecting up from the dry soil. Vera worked the row beside them without slowing, without seeking shade, pulling weeds with the automatic efficiency of a person for whom this was not effort, but simply the texture of a day. Liesel watched her constantly, in the way young people watch someone who contradicts an expectation so thoroughly that watching seems like the only reasonable response. Vera Calloway was nothing like any image of an American woman that had appeared in the newsreels Liesel had grown up watching. Those women had been soft, idle, decorative, painted symbols of a society too comfortable to sustain itself, according to the voice that narrated such things. This woman had hands that looked like she had been using them her entire life. There was a scar along her left forearm, pale and old, that looked like it had come from machinery. She had not offered its story, and no one had asked. At mid-morning, Vera straightened and looked at the sky in the way farmers read weather, with the eyes rather than the face, some internal calculation running below the surface. Then she turned toward the house without a word. "Break," Marsh said, translating the implication. They followed her to the porch, where a water pump stood beside a tin basin. Vera worked the handle and filled the basin and stepped back, drying her hands on her trousers. The water was cold. Hilda cupped it in both hands and pressed it against the back of her neck and felt something in her spine release that she had not known was held. Then Vera said something to Marsh, and Marsh turned to the women. "She's asking if you want to come inside while she gets the water jugs." A silence passed between the women. Not suspicion exactly, more the instinct of people who had learned to be careful about the meaning of open doors. Liesel was already moving toward the screen. The kitchen was not large. It had a wooden table in the center, for chairs, a cast iron stove, and a window above the sink that looked out onto the yard where the two trucks sat in the sun. It smelled of coffee and something baked, an earlier hour's work. Hilda stepped inside and stopped. The shelves ran along the entire south wall, floor to ceiling, fitted with a wooden rail at each edge to keep things from sliding. And they were full. Not full in the way of a display or a deliberate arrangement. Full in the way of a place where food simply was, because it arrived and was stored and was used and arrived again. Canning jars in rows, their contents visible through the glass. Tomatoes, beans, corn, peaches, something dark that might have been cherries. Flour in a tin container large enough to require 2 hands to move. Sugar beside it. Salt. Coffee. Oats. Crackers in a paper sleeve. A bowl of eggs on the counter, 12 of them, sitting in the open as though eggs were not something to be counted and rationed and allocated, but simply a thing a household had. Hilda stood and looked at the shelves for a long moment. In Munich, in the last winter of the war, her mother had written to her about the ration reductions. Bread cut again. Fat allocation halved. The bakery on their street opened only 3 days a week, and lines beginning before dawn. Her mother had mentioned it the way people mention weather. Something happening to everyone, beyond personal remedy, endured collectively. Liesel had come to stand beside her. The girl said nothing, but her eyes moved along the shelves with a slow and slightly stunned attention, as though she were reading something written in a language she almost understood. Ingrid stood near the door. She had stepped inside, but not far, and she held her body with the particular tension of someone who had made a decision not to react, and was working to maintain it. Her eyes crossed the shelves once, and then moved to the window, and stayed there. Vera lifted 2 large metal water jugs from beside the stove, and set them on the table with a sound that was simply practical. A task completed, another waiting. She looked up and caught Hilda's expression. There was no triumph in Vera Calloway's face. No awareness that the shelves behind her represented something extraordinary. She looked at Hilda with the mild attentiveness of a woman who notices a guest has paused, and wonders briefly if something is needed. Then she picked up the jugs, and moved toward the door. Marsh held it open for her. As Hilda turned to follow, she took one more look at the shelves, at the canning jars standing in their rows, at the bowl of eggs, at the bag of flour that would be replaced when it was empty, because here things were replaced when they ran out, because here things did not simply run out. She said nothing, but as she stepped back into the heat of the yard, she felt the first small loosening of something she had carried so long she had forgotten it had a shape. The afternoon began with a belt. One of the 2 trucks in the yard had developed a problem in its drive mechanism, a worn belt on the auxiliary pump that Vera had noticed that morning and intended to replace before the week's end. She mentioned it to Marsh with the same tone she used for everything, a tone that treated mechanical failure as a scheduling matter rather than a crisis, and Marsh related to the group without particular emphasis. Marta heard the word belt in translation and looked up from the water jug she was drinking from. "Which truck?" she asked. Marsh blinked. He looked at Vera. Vera looked at Marta with a new quality of attention, not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of someone who has just received unexpected information about a person they had filed under a simpler heading. "The smaller one," Vera said through Marsh. Marta handed her water jug to Liesel and walked toward the truck without further comment. What followed was not a performance. Marta Hoffman had no interest in performing. She had grown up maintaining the equipment on her family's land east of Leipzig with whatever parts could be found, improvised, or borrowed from neighbors, and she approached Vera's truck with the same direct and unsentimental attention she had given every machine that had ever needed her. She opened the hood, studied the engine layout for a moment, found the auxiliary pump, traced the belt, and identified the wear without touching anything. It hasn't broken yet, she said to Marsh, still looking at the engine. But it will, probably in the next 2 or 3 days under load. You have a spare, Marsh translated. Vera went to the barn and came back with the belt still in its paper sleeve. Marta looked at it, checked the size against what she could see in the engine, nodded once. I can replace it now if she wants. 20 minutes. Vera looked at her for a moment. Then she handed her the belt and went back to the barn to retrieve a tool tray. Hilda watched this from near the field's edge, where she had been readying a section of tomato vine that had come loose from its stake. She watched Marta receive the tools, lay them in order on the truck's running board, and begin working with the particular economy of someone for whom this was natural territory. She watched Vera crouch beside her after a moment, not supervising, but watching with the interested attention of someone who respected competence and wanted to learn the specific technique. 2 women, 1 truck, no shared language, and yet something was being communicated with complete clarity. Ingrid appeared beside Hilda without announcing herself. She had been working the far end of the tomato row and had come back for more twine, but now she had stopped and was watching the same scene. She knows engines, Hilda said. Marta grew up on a farm, Ingrid replied. The observation carried a faint edge, something between concession and dismissal, as though she were acknowledging a fact while reserving the right to decide later what it meant. They stood in silence for a moment. The trucks are newer than anything we had in the last year, Hilda said, not to Ingrid particularly, but to the space between them. Ingrid said nothing. Both of them, Hilda added. Ingrid turned back to the tomato row and reached for the twine. A farm this size needs equipment, she said. That is not remarkable. Hilda did not argue. She was not, by temperament, a person who argued. She was a person who wrote things in columns and let the numbers speak for themselves. And the numbers here were speaking with a patience she found difficult to ignore. By midday, the belt had been replaced, the south field weeding was finished, and the barn had been mucked with the competent speed of Marta and Ruth working in parallel silence. Vera walked the completed work without theatrical approval. She looked at the field, looked at the barn, and nodded once at each, the nod of a person whose time is real and who does not waste it on formality. She had prepared lunch herself. It sat on the porch table when they returned to the house, sandwiches on bread that was white and soft in a way that Liesel stared at briefly before picking hers up, a bowl of potato salad, and a plate of something covered in a cloth that turned out to be sliced cake when the cloth came off. A cake, made on a Tuesday in June on a working farm in the middle of a harvest season. Ruth sat down and looked at the plate with an expression that was not quite readable but carried, somewhere in its stillness, a quality of attention that was different from her usual watchfulness. Liesel lifted a piece of the cake and held it for a moment as though it might resolve into something explicable if she waited long enough. She made this today? She asked Marsh. This morning, Marsh said. Before you arrived. Liesel put the cake in her mouth and chewed slowly and looked out at the yard. Ingrid ate her sandwich with her eyes on the middle distance. She ate everything on the plate. All of it, carefully, the way people eat who know what it means when food is present, who were trained by years of ration cards not to leave things behind. That training, Hilda observed, was something they shared with Vera Calloway's enemies and Vera Calloway's neighbors alike. It was the one thing the war had given everyone equally. After lunch, Vera brought out water again, and then sat at the edge of the porch steps with a mug of coffee and a notebook, reviewing what appeared to be a list of the afternoon's tasks. She wrote in it with a pencil, crossing things off, adding others, the small administration of a working day that had no supervisor and no timekeeper other than herself. Hilda watched her and thought about the word alone. Not alone in the sense of lonely. Alone in the sense of entirely responsible. For the land. For the equipment. For the decisions about what to plant and when to harvest, and which belt was wearing down, and which field needed attention, and what needed to be bought in town, and what could wait another week. All of it running through one person's day without interruption or relief, because the person who shared it was somewhere in the Pacific managing a different set of demands. In the newsreels, in the pamphlets, in the careful architecture of what Hilda had been shown about American women throughout her adult life, this was not a figure that appeared. What appeared was softness. Dependency. Women defined by what they consumed rather than what they maintained. Women who needed their world managed for them because they were incapable of managing it themselves. Vera Calloway finished her coffee, closed the notebook, and stood. Eastfield, she said to Marsh. Beans need stringing. She walked off the porch without looking back. Ingrid stood slowly, watching Vera's retreating figure with an expression that had changed since the morning in a way that was small, but visible to anyone who had been watching closely enough, and Hilda had been watching closely. The certainty had not left Ingrid's face, but it had developed a crease. A single, barely visible line of something that was not yet doubt, but had the shape of a question beginning to form beneath the surface, the way ground shifts before it breaks. She picked up her hoe and followed Vera into the field. Hilda followed, and behind her came Liesel, who had put the last piece of cake carefully in her pocket when she thought no one was looking, not out of greed, but from the specific instinct of someone who had spent years learning that good things did not always come again. Ruth came last, as she always did. She paused at the porch edge for a moment, looking at the empty coffee mug Vera had left on the step. Then she picked it up, carried it inside to the kitchen counter, and came back out. No one had asked her to. She simply had. Late afternoon brought a different kind of light to the Kansas plains. The sun had moved past its highest point and the shadows began to lengthen from the west, pulling across the fields in slow diagonals that turned the wheat from brass to something closer to copper. The heat had not diminished, but it had changed character. Less aggressive now, more settled. The way summer heat in flatlands eventually makes peace with the landscape it has spent the day pressing against. Vera had been working the bean rows alongside them for 2 hours when she stopped, straightened, and looked toward the road with the particular attention of someone who has heard something before it is audible to others. A truck appeared on the gravel road. It slowed at the gate, turned in, and pulled up beside the 2 farm vehicles in the yard. The man who climbed out was older, gray at the temples, overalls, a hat pulled low against the angle of the sun. He raised a hand toward Vera without particular ceremony, and she raised one back. Marsh, who had been sitting on the fence at the field's edge consulting his clipboard, stood and watched with the mild alertness of someone whose job required him to pay attention to arrivals. Neighbor, Vera said, already walking toward the yard. He's borrowing the post digger. She said it to Marsh the way you explain something to a person who does not require the explanation, but will feel more comfortable having it. Marsh translated it anyway, in the direction of the women, as a matter of professional habit. Hilda straightened and watched the exchange in the yard. The neighbor, a man of perhaps 60, unhurried, with the broad hands of someone who had spent decades outdoors, went to the barn with Vera and came out carrying a piece of equipment between them, a mechanical post digger with a shaft and a heavy auger at one end. They loaded it into the back of his truck together, the way people load things when they have done it many times before, without instruction or negotiation, each taking a side. He said something to Vera that made her nod. Then he climbed back in his truck and drove out. The entire exchange had lasted perhaps 4 minutes. Liesel had stopped working and was watching the gate where the truck had turned back onto the road. He has a truck too, she said. Yes, Hilda said. That's 3 trucks on this road. Hilda did not reply immediately. She was already doing what she always did, assembling the figures. 3 trucks on a single gravel road that connected, as far as she could determine from the morning's drive, perhaps 8 farms. And those were only the trucks that had appeared in the last few hours. The actual number was likely higher. Marsh, she said. The corporal looked over from his fence post. How many farms are there between here and the camp? Marsh considered this with the mild expression of a man being asked about something so ordinary he has never counted it. Along this road? 8, maybe 10. More on the county road. And they all have trucks. He looked at her the way people look when a question reveals an assumption they did not know they were carrying. Most of them, he said. Some have more than one. Hilda turned back to the bean row. She pulled a vine and looped it against the string without looking at what she was doing, because her eyes had gone to a different kind of calculation. Ingrid was 3 rows away and had heard everything. She did not turn around. At 4:30, Vera needed a part from town. The auxiliary pump belt Marta had replaced that morning had revealed, in the process of its removal, that a second fitting further along the same line was developing where that would need attention before the end of the week. Vera made this discovery herself during a brief inspection after the afternoon's work and mentioned it to Marsh with the brisk practicality of someone adjusting a schedule, not reporting a problem. The part required a trip to Patterson, the nearest town, 12 miles east along the county road. Marsh made his decision quickly. I'll take 2, Newman and Hoffman. He looked at Hilda and Marta. You, because you know what you saw in the engine. You, because you can help carry. Ingrid watched them climb into the truck cab beside Marsh without expression. Liesel raised a hand in a small, slightly uncertain wave, as though she was not sure if the gesture was appropriate. Ruth stood with her arms at her sides and watched the truck back out of the yard with the same still attention she gave everything. The gravel road ran east between gaskets and seals and clamps and couplings arranged with the unhurried confidence of a place that expected to keep receiving what it sold. The man behind the counter was perhaps 50, with reading glasses on a cord around his neck and the comfortable authority of someone who knew where every item in the room was located. Marsh described what they needed. The man went directly to the correct shelf, pulled down 2 fittings, checked a third, decided it was also relevant, and placed all 3 on the counter with a brief explanation Marsh translated into German. The exchange took less time than it took Hilda to read the labels on the nearest shelf. She read them anyway. Belt sizes she recognized. Fittings she had seen requisitioned in allocation reports. Parts for machinery she had cataloged as scarce in the final year of the war, their absence recorded in her ledgers in the particular emptiness of a column that had once held numbers and then held nothing. Here they sat in open bins, available on a Tuesday afternoon in June to anyone who walked through the door with the right fitting number and the cost of the part. She stood very still for a moment. Marta was looking at the bearings section with an expression that had moved beyond assessment into something quieter and more private. Her hand rested on the edge of a bin without touching its contents, as though contact might require her to have a reaction she was not ready to articulate. On the drive back, the road rose briefly at a point where the county land swelled into a low ridge, not a hill. Exactly, nothing so dramatic as a hill, just a rise in the flatland that was enough to change the angle of vision and reveal what lay on either side. Marsh slowed the truck at the top. Not to show them. He slowed because the road narrowed at the crest, and he was a careful driver. But the effect was the same. The county opened on both sides. Farms spread in every direction, stitched together by roads that caught the late light like threads in a quilt. Barns stood at intervals, their red roofs faded to rose in the afternoon glow. Grain elevators marked the rail line in the distance, their gray cylinders rising above everything else with the practicality of structures that exist to hold what a region produces. 3 tractors moved in 3 different fields simultaneously, too far to hear, visible only as slow shapes tracing lines through crops that went on past the point between fields that had been plowed into long parallel furrows. The truck moved at a steady speed, and the Kansas landscape unrolled on either side with the absolute consistency of a place that had been doing the same thing for a very long time and saw no reason to change. Farm followed farm. This was the fact that accumulated with each passing quarter mile. Not dramatically, there was nothing theatrical about the way the land presented itself. But each property that appeared on either side of the road was complete in itself, with its barn and its outbuildings, and its vehicles, and its water tower, and its silo catching the late light. Some had cattle moving in the near pastures. One had a chicken operation, long low buildings set back from the road with a smell that reached them even with the windows down. Another had a combine parked under an open lean-to, its size suggesting it had been built to harvest at a scale that made Hilda's earlier estimates seem conservative. Marta sat in the truck bed with her back against the cab wall and watched it all go past with the focused attention of someone assessing, not appreciating. Her eyes moved from one property to the next with the specific quality of a person who knows what things cost and what they require, in labor, in capital, in infrastructure, and who is quietly adding those costs up against everything they thought they knew. She said nothing. Neither did Hilda. The county road came up after the gravel ended, wider and paved with a surface that had been recently maintained. More farms appeared, and with them more evidence of the same pattern, the same organization, the same equipment, the same stubborn and unspectacular abundance. A truck passed them going west, pulling a hay wagon. Another followed it at a short distance, carrying feed. A third came from a side road and pulled out ahead of them. 3 trucks. In 5 minutes. On one road. Patterson appeared at the end of a long straight stretch, a water tower first, then the grain elevator, then the shapes of buildings gathering themselves into something that could be called a town. It was not large, but it was complete in the way of places that have a reason to exist. A hardware store, a feed supplier, a machine parts shop with its name painted in neat letters above the window, a bank, a post office, a diner with a board outside listing the day's pie, cherry and apple, written in chalk. Marsh parked in front of the machine parts shop, and the 3 of them went inside. The smell was iron and rubber and the faint sweetness of machine oil, a smell Hilda associated with the supply depots of another life. Except those depots had smelled of shortage underneath the machinery, the particular odor of a system running at the edge of its capacity. This shop smelled of sufficiency. Shelves from floor to ceiling, organized with the same logic as Vera's barn pegboard. Belts in one section, fittings in another, spark plugs in rows, bearings in labeled bins. The eye could resolve individual plants into rows. Smoke rose from a machine shed somewhere to the south. A truck moved along a road to the north, then another behind it, then a third emerging from a farm track and pulling out to follow. It was not one farm. It was not 10. It was a county, a single administrative unit of a country that had thousands of them, each one running in the same rhythm, each one ordinary to the people inside it. Hilda sat in the truck cab and looked out the window and did not move. Marta, in the truck bed behind them, had gone completely still. Marsh put the truck back in gear and drove on, because this was a road he had driven before, and the view from this rise was not, to him, a revelation. It was simply the way Kansas looked in the afternoon. That, Hilda thought, was the most difficult part to hold in her mind. Not the farms, not the trucks or the tractors or the grain elevators marking the horizon like patient sentinels. The fact that no one here thought any of it was worth stopping for.